Good afternoon. This is the House Appropriations Committee. It is Tuesday, February 25th, 2025. It's just about 15 p.m. And we have with us the Center for Crime Victim Services to talk about their FY26 budget. And I don't think you've been in here yet this year, so why don't we go around and introduce ourselves and we can meet all the members of the committee.
Good afternoon. I'm Dave Yakovani from Morrisville. I represent Lamoille, Washington. Greetings.
Please.
Good afternoon and welcome. John Kosenska from Burke. I represent the Essex Caledonia District.
Thank you.
Hi, Mike Nigro. I represent Bennington and Pelham.
Tom Stevens from Waterbury, representing the Washington Chittenden District.
For Jim Harrison, Chittenden, Mendon.
Robin Chai from Middlebury.
Jeff Lewin, Burlington.
Trevor Squirrel, Jericho and Underhill.
Randy Rush, Franklin, Highgate, Hampshire.
Good afternoon. Mike Moore with the Mendon 4 District, Putney and Blackstone.
Hi, Lynn Dickinson. I represent St. Albans Town.
Now you're going to introduce yourself for the record.
Good afternoon, committee. For the record, my name is Jennifer Pullman. I'm the director at the Vermont Center for Crime Victim Services. And unfortunately for you, but most unfortunate for me, my financial director, Carol Brochu, is unexpectedly unable to attend. So I will do my best to be Carol Brochu, but do expect that there will probably be some questions I'll be getting back to you with answers over the next couple of days.
And that's fine. And Trevor is your liaison here too. So if we have questions, we can go through Trevor.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Just to get started, and I really want to thank the committee for giving us some time to talk about our budget, which for a very small agency is actually rather complicated. With respect to what brings us, what we have today, we did make an ask of the governor. We did receive a 3% increase, but other than that, our requests were not provided. So we're kind of starting from square one at this point. I do want to just underscore that there's been so much conversation in this building about public safety and community safety. And really, as you're thinking about what we have to offer today and what our needs are, support for victim services and actually having services for victims really needs to be an integral part of that conversation. And just want to have that as the framework. With respect to the center itself, we are this odd agency, and I won't spend a lot of time, but we're a state agency with no state employees. We're one of these 5 quasi-state agencies that exist, which creates some interesting situations for us as an agency. We do have 19 staff, 3 of whom are part-time. The others are full-time, and we administer 2 direct service programs and also a grants program. And I'm going to focus on those 3 programs. We do other things, but for purposes of what you're interested in, I'm going to focus on our 2 direct service and our grants program. One of the direct service programs we have is established in statute. That's our victims compensation program. That program provides direct payments to eligible victims upon a finding of probable cause. So right at the outset of a case, it doesn't have to wait till conviction. Right at the outset, we can provide payments to victims to reimburse them for certain crime-related losses like medical, mental health, childcare, transportation to court, some of those expenses, temporary relocation. So that's where our victims compensation program comes in and provides support to communities. Our restitution program is established in state statute as well. It is a state program, but receives no general funds. That's supported through a 15% surcharge on criminal fees, fines, and traffic tickets. And that program does a wonderful job of both making sure that victims are paid through a fund so that victims aren't waiting until the person who is convicted and owes restitution is actually able to make that payment. So we work with the offender or the person who caused harm to try and recoup that restitution, but we're able to provide support to individual victims for their crime-related losses upon conviction. Our grants program is where we do a lot of the meat of our work. We provide over grants to 60 different programs in your communities, and over 240 individual sub-grants are issued. And in our overview handout, we do have a map at the back that shows all the different programs that we fund, both within your counties and across the state. And our grants program is a wonderful program because it gives us a chance to really work with the people in the field and provide support and services and gives us a great snapshot of what's happening in Vermont and where those gaps are and where those needs are. We do provide a lot of support for programs. In this role, we do site visits, we do strategic planning for the state to look at victim services. We are constantly reviewing budgets, providing technical support and assistance and training. So many of our directors are amazing advocates, but not everybody knows how to do QuickBooks or bookkeeping. I was in that position a few years ago, and I was like, I know how to do the work, but I don't know how to balance a budget. So we really provide some hands-on support in that regard. Now, as you might have noticed from our handouts, and if not, I'll certainly indicate that there are handouts that pretty clearly illustrate that, on this wonderful pie chart, we have a very small sliver of funds that comes from general fund dollars. Only about $1.6 million of what the center receives in funding overall, even though we're a state agency, is in general fund dollars. And those dollars, I do want to underscore, are generally straight pass-through. The center does not receive administrative support to provide those funds out to the community. So of that 1.6, the majority do go straight into your communities to support the network programs, child advocacy centers, supervised visitation programs, some prosecutors who are specialized in domestic sexual violence. So those are straight pass-through funds we administer with no grant, with no administrative funds retained. There is a small portion of general funds that we do receive that we are able to use for the center itself, for some of our IT expenses, vision. We also were really grateful that this committee provided us with funds for a grants position. When I speak about our grants program, it consists of essentially two people, our finance director and our senior grants manager. We now finally have been able to hire somebody as of February 3rd to help with that, the grants administration, but also help to find grants so we can bring in additional money into the state. We get formula grants, but discretionary grants are out there, but we just don't have the capacity to be able to do that. So really grateful that that position is finally filled. Thank you.
So Jennifer, you get a little over 5 million from federal funds. Have you had any problem drawing down those funds recently, or has anything been frozen, or are you okay?
Luckily, Carol Brochu, my director, worked into the night, several nights, to be able to draw down all of those funds quickly before there was a halt. So for right now, our programs that we provide funds for are okay. She was able to do that before there was the shutdown. That doesn't mean, and I'll speak to that this air of uncertainty has not been extremely traumatic for our programs and for us in terms of trying to provide support to folks who are already doing really challenging work.
What agency of federal government does your funding come through?
Primarily the Department of Justice. Our major grants are the Victims of Crime Act dollars that we receive, the Violence Against Women, STOP, which stands for Services Training. I always get this one wrong. I detail the different grants, but our STOP grant, and we also receive some grants through the Agency of Human Services, our FVIPSA grants. So I'm just going to look at those two to understand what all these acronyms stand for. Family Violence Prevention Services Act. So that's FVIPSA, that comes through the Agency of Human Services. That grant we will be retaining, but there were 3 ARPA grants that came through the Agency of Human Services that will be ending as of September 30th. They currently provide $777,000 to the state of Vermont, and those grants, like other ARPA grants, will be ending on the 30th. Pardon me, STOP refers to services, training, officers, and prosecutors. So even though we all administer that grant, we always get stuck in the acronyms and forget what they actually stand for. So we spoke about the general funds. So largely, as you mentioned, Madam Chair, that we've received most of our funds are federal funds. And I actually learned last week in House Judiciary when we presented that when the state sort of did looked over what state agencies were kind of in that high risk category, given the recent events, that the center was had the I guess, the fortune or a bad fortune of being in that high risk category because we receive so many federal funds. And even the special funds, and I'm going to speak to that, but you have to look at with the special funds and the federal funds. Our programming, I mean, the center, but our programming and our grants are so reliant, so over-reliant on the vagaries of revenue streams that have been in decline. That's been no surprise to this body. We've been very proactive. Back in 2013, there was a study that was issued out of this body that said, this can't go on, it's not sustainable. There was a report in 2022 that echoed the same piece. And so it's very, very challenging. And I think about what Carol has to do in terms of the finance director of a state agency. Other state agencies come in and they have a general sense, like, this is what we have, this is what we're going to get, this is additional pieces that we need. Wherein our funding stream does not provide that luxury to Carol, who is constantly having to build budgets and issue grants based on projections and predictions. We have funding streams that come in through two different fiscal years, the state fiscal year ending obviously on June 30th, but the federal fiscal year ends on September 30th. We then have the special funds that vary from month to month. So she has done an amazing job of basically projecting what we can expect, but it creates a really tenuous situation for her, for the center, and for our programs to continue to try and play that guessing game with our funds. So, and again, with respect to the federal funds, I really want to drill down on VOCA. I did mention that we have the 3 ARPA grants that we are losing as of September 30th, that again provide currently $777,000 to our state. VOCA is the largest grant that the state receives, and that grant has been in decline as well for the past few years. It's a grant that, much like our own surcharge, depends on fees and fines from criminal convictions going into a fund. And for a variety of reasons, that has been on decline due to either policy changes or simply just not obtaining convictions of some of these more, higher level businesses that commit malfeasance, let's say. Last year, we received $3 million in VOCA funding. For this coming fiscal year, we're looking at $1.9 million. So we will have a loss of $1.1 million in VOCA funding. And our VOCA grant provides support for 46 different programs. Those programs include the network, child advocacy centers, a lot of the programs that I mentioned to you before, restorative justice programs. I know this committee's been talking about restorative justice for the past few years. It supports our legal partnership for crime victims, the legal aid we work with in order to provide services for victims outside the criminal process. It supports the human trafficking positions that we have, forensic nursing, deaf Vermonters victim advocacy services, other underserved populations. And so when we're looking at a loss of $1.1 million to these programs, for many programs, this is the largest grant that they also receive. So we're in a real place where we're looking at these programs that to date we haven't had to cut. Other states have had to make those cuts. And we haven't had to actually say we're pulling back funds or we have to cut your positions. We've been able to do that because we've always level funded. For the past 15 years, we've provided only level funds to programs. So no, there haven't been technically cuts, but there haven't been cost of living increases either to these positions. So we're at a place where we're looking at our subgrantees and thinking, we're finally here. We're at a place where we need to make cuts. And who among those programs would we even begin to contemplate cutting? Because right now they are doing extremely challenging work in an environment that's only become more challenging for them. I was talking with my grants manager before I left the building, our building today, and she had mentioned that most of the direct service providers that we fund who are right on the front line are making in the 20s an hour. And I think about the challenges to these advocates, to these providers when we keep asking them to do more. And the cases that are coming their way, victims are presenting with more complex needs, not only the trauma from the crime itself, but substance misuse, mental health challenges, housing, elements of trafficking are showing up in some of the cases as well. And in some of our, victims who are coming forward looking for help. And it really is stressful to think about the fact that when people are coming for help, when they're looking for help, that we could be in a place where we are saying we can't help you. We don't have a person to help you. We don't have that service anymore. And
Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I don't want to sound insensitive. It's just my lack of familiarity. I keep thinking here about restitution. But what I'm hearing through the lines a little bit is our services also.
yes.
And I'm wondering how much of your budget goes to somebody stole my lawnmower and it costs $400 and we're gonna help you with the cost of that versus I need other services to help me with the pain of all that.
We have, our grants program is almost entirely a straight pass-through. So we receive over almost $10 million in grants that we distribute out to the state in the vast majority of
And
the
that
funding.
goes to individuals?
That goes to programs. That goes to programs in the field. As far as the victims' compensation program, which is payments to victims, we're looking at, probably about like $500,000 that goes out directly to victims in terms of payments. That can vary every month. It depends on what the crime is and what the expense is.
So the majority of the money goes to the programs.
Yes.
And the programs do,
The programs that, in terms of the grants, are all across, provide services all across the board. So again, we have the network program. So the network itself, its 14-member programs are providing services and support to victims of domestic and sexual violence and stalking. And while there's some variance, a lot of it is courtroom advocacy, responding to hotlines, working with victims on some of the other needs that I mentioned, housing, mental health referrals, and that nature. Child advocacy centers are places where children come or children are brought when there's been an allegation of abuse, and they are provided with a multidisciplinary response. So that's the service they provide. The human trafficking case managers are working 24/7 to respond and support to the needs of trafficking survivors. So there's a whole bunch of legal services, the Association of Africans Living in Vermont. There's a whole bunch of different programs all across the spectrum that we provide support to. And the only one that requires that there be a conviction for us to provide support to is restitution. The rest of these supports are available to victims without there being any conviction whatsoever.
thank you.
Rep. Harrison and then Rep. LaRouche.
Yeah, Jennifer, you mentioned that other states with similar programs have had to make cuts or reductions. And you, to this point, have not, even though you've been kind of level funded. So I'm wondering if you've looked at other states. There's a danger sometimes from trying to do everything but not doing any of it well because you don't have the resources, especially if they're stagnant, versus concentrating on your core services and doing a better job because that's where you're putting your funding. And I'm curious if you've learned anything from other states as to, what have they reduced so they can do their core functions better.
Well, sometimes it's hard to get a direct snapshot from other states. And I'm not saying this to divert from or to deflect from the question, because Vermont has this model where everything passes through the center. So we know all the programming that's existing for victim services. Whereas in other states, especially the bigger ones, might have a program that's completely siloed in a different way and receives funding in a different way. So it's kind of hard to get a snapshot. I do know that some of the things that we have looked at and have implemented to try and make change is, for example, the state's attorney's victim advocates. As some of you may recall who've been on this committee, a couple of years ago, there was the decision that was made to provide general fund dollars for those positions. As you know, that's a 27 position program right now. It used to be funded with a mixture of VOCA dollars and victims' compensation special funds. And you switch that. And I think that's really important to think about, like, that's a core function. Those were state positions that instead the Center for Crime Victim Services was using grant funds from here and special funds from here to do that kind of support. And you also did this 2 years ago with respect to the law enforcement advocates who are with the state police. They were state positions that now are state funded, and also with the Attorney General's victim advocate. Last year, you shifted that over to general funds because, again, that was a state position. So we brought to you some of those core state positions that were, you know, again, subject to these vagaries of funding and always at risk then of being cut.
So would it be fair to say some of the funding actually has increased because we've shifted it to the category, as opposed to coming out of your operation and your victims services fund? I remember the conversations with state police. I think that was last year, and also with the Attorney General, that might have been 2 years ago, I'm guessing, of funding those positions so it didn't have to come out of your organization.
I understand the thought, what you're thinking, Representative Harrison. I think that for us, it's not an increase as much as it was mitigating where we are now. Because if you all had not made those changes, I don't think the center would, I don't even know who we'd have on staff. So it really has created this situation where the state has said, these are state positions, we're going to take care of them. And we're left with what we do feel are those core services that don't rely on a state response to a victim when they've been harmed. And that they provide that also that wraparound support when the victim, if the victim does come forward and utilize the criminal justice process. So it's a complement that works really well. I wish I could, I wish our job was easier and that we were left with programs that didn't really feel critical. These programs, especially now more than ever, feel really critical when people, again, remain fearful of, especially when people remain fearful of coming forward for a variety of reasons.
But well, it sounds like about 5% of your budget goes to actual restitution to victims, approximately $500,000 out of $10 million.
That's the Victims' Compensation Program. Our restitution program, we pay about $84,000 a year out to victims from that $84,000 a year from our restitution.
Yeah,
That's for victims' compensation for the year.
6% of your total. If you're convicted of a crime and the court says, part of your penalty is also going to be paying $50,000 over time to the criminal victims fund. Does that go back to, does that just go to your organization or does that go to individuals either from that crime or other crimes?
If we have an identified victim, it always goes directly to the victim, whether it be an individual or a business. If for some reason the victim has passed away, we do have pieces in place where that money can go directly to somebody that they designate. Otherwise, it just goes into the fund itself, which is what we use to pay victims in terms of an advancement from the fund while we wait to collect from somebody that could take 10, 20, it may never happen, but we advance the victim and get them out of the picture as soon as possible.
So these are the entities that has to be go through on the this big list, right? But what do you call them? I mean, it seems like it's like a parallel to the authorized agencies that we have in the criminal side, or when you're talking about reentry out of prison or addiction services, mental health services like that. It was a network of different groups that would be that way, right?
Yes, it is, but the tie-ins are especially, I know our network programs and some of our other underserved populations that work with underserved populations are really hand in glove with a lot of those other services.
So are any of these entities also providing the other services? Or are these separate? Is it two separate networks, or are the networks interconnected such that monies might flow from human services one way and from you or human services your way, or federal government either way? Is it separate, or?
I see it as separate, and I think it's just a different point of entry. So, for example, if I'm working at a child advocacy center or working at a community-based domestic violence or sexual violence program, and a victim comes to me because they were the victim of a crime, but through that advocacy, through those conversations, I found out, oh, this person doesn't have housing. Oh, I'm wondering about this person's mental health, or they're speaking to me about a substance misuse problem they have. So then I'm going to utilize my contacts and connections with those, and my knowledge of how those entities work and how those benefits work, those resources can be obtained, and I'm going to work with the victim to support them in that regard. So it's a different point of entry than I think some of the other services that you were talking about.
But you might direct them to those folks.
Oh, absolutely.
And so they could be entered in there. So it's a convoluted thing for me to understand. No, does all the money flow through your organization as a quasi-state entity that goes for victim services? Everything goes through there?
Well, I do know that, some of the other programs do receive money from other entities. So they are all nonprofits. So they are able to, do fundraising. They're able to obtain their own grants. So again, having been overseeing the child advocacy centers, I do know that there are other grant streams that come in that support those programs. I do know, though, that VOCA is one of the largest for some of the programs, without which they would have a real challenge.
Because I have been questioning the authorized agency system there about standardization. Are you providing the same services everywhere? Is there any kind of standardization? Are the services available, across the regions of the state, in an equitable manner, if you want to use that word? And so just trying to wrap my mind around, what are we providing for? Who's doing it? Do they have the skills, and are they providing the services that we hope that they would? And who has control over it? And is it functioning well enough? Should it be more? What should we be doing differently, if anything?
I think that I appreciate the question, and I've thought about this because I was asked this a couple of weeks ago. I think the model we have is actually one that works very well. Again, as I mentioned, Vermont's one of the few states that has really this kind of centralized component, and it does enable us to do strategic planning and with all of our subgrantees to sort of identify gaps, and we've had some great ideas that float to the top from those conversations. But it also gives them the space to have some sort of organic growth in their own community. Like, this is what my community needs. Yours might not, but these programs have standards. Child advocacy centers do have national standards they adhere to. The network programs, they have standards. Supervised visitation programs have standards. So there's a baseline wherein if I'm a victim or a survivor, there's a certain expectation that I would be receiving these types of services, and they would be delivered in a certain manner. So there are baseline standards that exist. Over and above that, we do those site visits every year. We go out to our programs, and we're not there to do audits. We're there to say, like, what are your challenges? How can we help you? Maybe say, well, this program's doing it this way. As far as programs that are not being served, I agree that's a huge concern for us. We do receive the rural grant from the federal government that targets violence in communities, in rural communities, and provides specific funding to try and provide, again, additional services that are specific to our rural communities. And we do receive that grant to, again, try and target some of those concerns.
Any questions? So continue then, or?
Well, I will,
Yeah, we should be getting to the ups and downs,
Okay.
I'm guessing.
oh, sure. Let's do the ups and downs. This is where I probably plead the fifth, or not the fifth, but I make a list and get back to you all, but I'll do my best.
Well, it looks like it's, we're just looking at it quickly and Squirrel may have some other things. It looks like the things that are down are because your federal funds grants are going down. Otherwise, it's a 3%. You said it was basically a 3%
Yes.
increase over last year.
And our special funds continue to decline and create challenges. So both of our main funding streams are in a direction that, continue to trend downwards, and there's no changes there and no changes anticipated. And we do have the same increases that other state agencies do in terms of, health insurance and the like. Unfortunately for the center, with no state employees, proportionally bear a more significant portion of those increases.
So when the ARPA funds go away, which we all knew that they would at some point, so you'll just stop doing whatever the programs or the services were that were associated with that.
Yes, and our sub-grantees are aware of that.
Okay.
That's why, our ask will cover what is needed to keep the doors open. And so we are accounting for that loss.
Any other questions, Trevor?
Do you want to speak to the box?
Yes.
Okay, just real quick.
Yep.
Just very quickly.
What are we looking at?
Three of us on this committee have been around together on this committee.
We've been around.
And we've had this annual conversation. We understand the work they do and the importance of the work that we do. And with our actions and or the administration's actions, have worked to find ways to, like, we moved the applicants' funding into a general fund. We looked at positions to move them around to give you some help. We backfilled special funds. Special funds continue to decline. Federal fund obviously took a big hit this year. So I think it's only been 1 of the 5 years that I've been working with your organization that you haven't been here asking for support. It's a challenge. And what I'm seeing here, you have about 2.4 million in deficits across the federal fund and the two special funds. But maybe you could speak to the 115,000 that's on here also.
Yes.
So where we're looking for people, the
Yeah,
box that is on page 4 of 6 of the one that has the map on the back.
It's actually on the last page of the narrative as well.
There really is a box.
So with respect to the 115,000 that we're asking for, because we have been in here for 5 years straight, apparently asking, and but we always do ask for the bare minimum. But we've never asked for money for administrative support for the center. And VOCA not only promises this decrease to have a huge hit for our programs, but it's also the grant that we rely upon for our administration. Other than the one position that we had last year, the rest of the staff at the center are funded with federal and special fund dollars. So as I mentioned, we currently pass through $2.3 million to subgrantees without taking a single dollar for administrative support. And we're simply asking for $115,000 to provide us with the funding to do the work that we do in terms of grant administration and financial administration. And also, especially this is a critical ask now more than ever, because with VOCA being what it is, we don't know who else to cut. Representative Squirrel asked when I came in, I said, Carol Brochu wasn't here. And he said, I guess your trench probably isn't that deep. And I said, well, I'll kind of be the poster person for what it's like when your agency is very short staffed, because I have no Carol. So it's, and there's nobody that can back her up. So it would be really helpful to the center and to the center's health if we were to be able to have some administrative support for a grant-making functions. With respect, I know that the compensation, do I have 1 more minute?
Yes.
I know that the compensation program asks, the deficit is exactly $562,000 that's projected. And we really do, we try to think about how we can avoid this or mitigate this moving forward. And we have tried to make some changes, but certainly the impact of the increase in homicides is huge on our program. Because if when somebody is killed, the survivor's immediate family are all eligible for their own claim. So that is a very real expense to our program. Again, needs are becoming more complex. But what we've been working on trying to do, most importantly for the future health of the fund, is trying to, again, get away from funding other positions and other programming that is outside of what you intended when you established the Victims' Compensation Fund. By that, I'm referring back to the victim advocate for the state's attorney's office. That was $712,000 that came out of the Victims' Compensation Fund each year to support that program. Again, with gratitude, you all made that shift. Also, we have supported supervised visitation programs and also 2 positions at the network with those funds. And I've been in conversation with the network that we cannot afford to do that. So we are looking at this as a one-time fund that will enable us, a one-time infusion of funds that will enable us to kind of just right set where we are and moving forward, working again with the revenue stream that we have. But the compensations fund was doing well for a while, and we took on more than we could to keep positions afloat. And so now we're looking to just rein it in and focus on the compensation program.
Now, we heard question, do you provide any services before the crime is adjudicated?
Yes.
Because, we've heard testimony, we have 96 outstanding unadjudicated murders and manslaughters sitting out there. So I was wondering whether or not you're already incurring those expenses or that's something that you're gonna have as a responsibility for the future.
We already are, and that's one of the pieces about the compensation program that really I'm most proud of in terms of what we can do for victims, because just upon a finding that a crime was committed, regardless of who did it, or if even a prosecutor decides to bring it forward, we can immediately start to work with that victim. So crime scene cleanup for a homicide, funeral expenses, those hit families right away. And we can be in that position to step in and take off some of that burden so that they can do the hard work without having to worry about paying a bill.
Other questions?
Just one quick one.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Do you give out 16 network grants or do you give out one grant and then the network disperses?
We provide it directly to the network, and then they have a funding formula.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, for coming in. You did just fine.
Well, thank you. And I could have talked for days, but I do have, it's all in my my handouts, and I'm always available for questions.
That's great. Yeah, and Trevor will follow up if we have other questions. So
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time.
okay, thank you. Committee, we're going to work on some things ourselves, but let's take a break until 3 o'clock, and then we'll come back and get